The next few months in Ukraine will determine the war. We'll find out if Ukraine has the resources to put together a major offensive and how Russia has or hasn't prepared to defend against it. Now, there are variations of what success or failure could look like, and we'll dig into a few here. But if Ukraine wants to win this war militarily, they're going to have to go big. Now, to identify any sort of path to victory, we have to come to an agreement on what that victory might actually look like. And for the sake of my argument here, I'm using the restoration of Ukrainian territorial integrity as their primary goal. In that, I would include Crimea and the Donbass, essentially Ukrainian territorial boundaries as they existed before 2014. Now, war is messy. There's a lot more at stake than just boundaries, but to avoid going down never-ending hypothetical rabbit holes, we got to start somewhere. And there are folks much better suited than I to get into how economics or internal politics of the two nations could end things sooner. I'm going to stick with what's going on in the battlefield. So first, let's get into the concept of a long war. Looking back at the start of the conflict, it was a solid few months before really this entered the conversation at all. I mean, even when we get past the folks who thought Ukraine would fall in 72 hours, there were still a lot of people who expected the war to end sometime later in the spring or that summer. It's worth remembering that. It's easy to forget that there weren't very many people out there before this war kicked off that could have anticipated Ukraine holding back the Russian army for a full year of all-out war. Now, I'm in the camp that a long war doesn't actually favor Ukraine or Russia. To me, there are just too many variables that have to work out in your favor, but not the other way, for it to be any sort of clear advantage. For instance, an argument that Russia is favored in a long war is that they have the manufacturing base and the population to draw on as the war drags out. And while Russia has made some progress around the current sanctions, it's not yet clear how that'll impact their defense industry in the long term. Maybe they'll find workarounds for the materials they no longer have access to, or maybe they won't. Same goes for the personnel side of things. Yes, Russia has more people than Ukraine and could still run through a few mobilizations to increase the size of their force, but the last one wasn't exactly sunshine and roses. I mean, plenty of people left the country, and it did cause quite a few protests. I'm certain Russia could pull more people into the military, but how many? And for how long? Now, turning to the Ukrainian side, it's no secret that their ability to continue the fight in this manner is directly dependent on Western aid. No treaties, no alliances, essentially just NATO countries waking up and deciding that today they're going to continue supporting Ukraine. That could turn on a dime, and even a downward trend in supplies headed over will have a major impact on the Ukrainian ability to wage war. I don't think a prudent leader in the Ukrainian military would base any sort of future plans off the expectation that Western aid is unlimited and unending. Now, I don't see any signs that it's stopping or slowing anytime soon, but planning on unlimited future aid could be a catastrophic mistake for Ukraine. Realistically, they have to consider how to win with what they have on hand now and what's on the way. Now, this current Pentagon leak isn't helping the situation. In my last video, I talked a little bit about it and how the data could be used, but it was early enough that there was still quite a bit of speculation about its authenticity. But as of today, April 11th, it's looking more and more like those documents were legit. Of all the government announcements after these came out, only Ukraine, from what I've seen, has brushed it off as some sort of Russian plant or misinformation, which isn't crazy. It's to Ukraine's advantage to discredit anything that potentially gives away sensitive information about their forces or plans, and there's really zero incentive for Ukraine to look at those documents and say, yep, totally accurate. On the Russian side, they seem to be treating the documents as real. Dmitry Peskov, the presidential spokesperson, used the documents to highlight NATO involvement in the war, and the detail of information even kind of triggered some pro-Russian military bloggers. Dmitry of War Translated did this translation here, where a pro-Russian military blogger complained that these leaks explain why Ukraine was always ready for their attacks, even saying that the U.S. appears to know more about Russian plans than Putin. So stepping out, though, U.S. agencies and allies all around the world seem to be in a bit of damage control over the last few days, trying to determine the impact of these leaks. The Ukraine stuff got a lot of attention, but there were also other pieces in there, some of which showed that the U.S. has recently spied on our allies, including Ukraine, Israel, and South Korea. Now, spying on our friends isn't exactly new, but some of these reports talk about signals intelligence, which would mean some sort of intercepted call or communication. So if it's a fake put out by the U.S., we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot a bit here, really pissing off some key allies, which is another piece here that I think adds to the authenticity of the documents. This is going to force the U.S. to have to mend some important bridges in the very short term, but there's another major impact here for Ukraine. The source of the leak isn't yet known, or at least it isn't public. And anytime an organization has sensitive data like this released, it's not as though they just spin up an investigation and everything else goes along like nothing happened. There are going to be all sorts of tighter control measures. Maybe some personnel and organizations get moved out of the inner circle and no longer have access to this information. Trust is decreased not just between allies, but even within some of these U.S. agencies. Over time, that's something we can mend, but it's not the type of organizational hiccup you want in the middle of a war, especially when Ukraine is planning an attack that could determine if they win or lose the conflict. On another kind of related note, it'll be interesting to see the level of intelligence sharing between the United States, NATO, and Ukraine whenever this war ends. I'm sure it'll be 50 plus years before that information comes out, if it ever does, but it's starting to look more and more like we are really in the weeds on the intel side of things. So even if we take the optimistic view that the leaked documents didn't reveal anything directly pertinent to the Ukrainian offensive, it's likely there will be some change in the U.S.-Ukrainian relationship. Even if only tied to intel sharing, that's going to create a bottleneck that wasn't there just 1 week ago. Next, it's worth talking about timing, not in terms of the day, week, or month an offensive could take place, but in the bigger picture. The Ukrainian military is arguably stronger today than they've ever been. I understand that's kind of a bold statement to make, but if you look at the modern equipment they fielded over the past year, the growth in size of their armed forces and the experience in the ranks, it's significant. Now, alongside that came a lot of casualties and substantial loss of existing equipment. But if we consider the troops that have gone off to training and come home, the new gear coming in, and no major Ukrainian offensives in the last 6+ months, this is probably as strong a force as they can expect to have for quite a while. So now is sort of the time for an offensive. As I talked about earlier, banking on another year of Western equipment is pretty risky, and who knows the level of attrition Ukrainian forces will suffer over the next 10 to 12 months if they push this down the road. All right, so let's take a look at the battlefield and where this offensive might take place. So it's going to take a major effort to see any sort of serious breakthrough anytime soon. I'm talking an offensive the size we haven't seen since Russia crossed the border a year ago. There's just far too many minefields, anti-tank guided missiles, and drones hovering over the battlefield at all times. On the other hand, Ukraine chipping away at a few kilometers in the Donbass doesn't do much to really alter the nature of the fight. I mean, if Russia were to be pushed out of Bakhmut or back across the Donetsk River, do you really see the war coming to a screeching halt? I don't. To me, that's more of what we've seen for about 10 months now. Minor changes in territory at a high cost of lives, lines reestablished, and the fight goes on. There is, however, one piece of terrain that has outsized effects on the war: Crimea. Crimea is an emotional location for both sides. Ukraine desperately wants to take it back, and Russia is putting a lot of resources into holding it. I mean, look at this map that Brady Afric put together on Twitter. It maps known Russian defensive positions that have been identified with commercial satellite imagery. That area between Zaporozhye and Crimea looks to be the most heavily defended. Now, to be fair, I'm sure not every dot on this map is equal. One might be a single bunker with a machine gun, and another a complex fighting position behind obstacles, overwatching a minefield with ATGMs stacked on the high ground. Seeing the concentration of these defensive positions tells me that taking or threatening to take Crimea could be an initial move in a coming offensive. If Russia views Crimea as under threat, it's possible they would reallocate troops and resources to its defense. In turn, that may open up possibilities for a breakthrough elsewhere along the front. But I don't really see that the other way around. They're not going to loosen the lines north of Crimea to protect, Bakhmut, for instance. I'm not going to get into predictions of what the operations plan would look like here because Ukraine's force structure and capabilities are unknown. So moving pieces around a map would just kind of be make-believe. So I'll be nice and vague. Keep an eye on Crimea. The challenge for Ukraine here is that going after Crimea could be incredibly costly. We've already looked at the defensive positions, and they're not just at the line of contact. This would be an intense fight start to finish and on multiple fronts. Any sort of Ukrainian penetration towards Crimea is going to face Russian resistance from 2, maybe 3 sides. That means that if not planned and resourced correctly, that assaulting force can quickly be cut off and eliminated. It's hard to envision right now a Ukrainian push that retakes all of Crimea sometime in the next few months, but something short of that, maybe cutting off northern access and isolating the peninsula, could be in the cards if Ukraine went all in on that front. The risk, though, is that to do something of significance against these Russian defenses in the south would require a massive push of manpower, vehicles, and munitions. You can't go halfway on this. That makes any move on Crimea high risk, but high reward. If they pull it off and Russia is forced to reallocate troops from other areas of the front, that could set the stage for a follow-on phase of the offensive against the then depleted Russian lines in the Donbass. Again, with all going according to plan, Ukraine could wait a bit after their first push to shift their assets east before pressing forward, trying to split the DPR and LPR east of Severodonetsk. To me, at that point, we may see the overall fracturing of the Russian military. Russian leadership will then likely prioritize the defense of Crimea, and that leaves the Donbass exposed to Ukrainian advance. That would rile up some folks inside of Russia. I mean, liberating the Russian citizens in this area was one of Putin's reasons for starting the war. It's the type of 1-2 punch you can see really start to unravel domestic support and any sort of confidence in Russia's handling of the war to date. Think about that. Putin having to explain how barely a year after what was supposed to be a quick, special military operation next door has turned into scrambling to retain control of Crimea. Of course, the Ukrainian offensive that fails sets the stage for an even longer conflict where both sides grind each other down day after day. And like I said earlier, I'm not sure either side can be overly confident in winning that long war. So if Ukraine wants to win the war in the near term, they got to go big. But that's all I got for now. We'll see y'all next time.